There's spooky technology in a new car. And I get, driver inattention warnings because it's tracking my eye movement. Anything that requires self-thought and self-selection is what we'll start to see eroded. You're not in control of your destiny. Revolution in electric vehicles that's happening. It's likely happening at a real pace, not because that's what people said they wanted, but because governments have intervened very heavily and said, actually, 5 years' time, that's all you can sell, guys. That is a manipulated choice.
Of all of these technologies, it's going to be so profound that they are going to have to step in and manipulate it. That's just a fact.
We want hoverboards. Well, do you know, interestingly, Lexus did actually make a hoverboard, and it does actually work.
Wow.
Whose fault is it if we run someone over? Who pays the insurance?
Even outside of automotive, I'm incredibly concerned about the impact that AI is going to have.
One of the things that Toyota are doing in Japan, they've effectively created a new city in the foothills of Mount Fuji. In there.
How big is this?
I've only seen pictures of it, but I think it's
This is Matthew Blake. He works in the value chain innovation space. We had the opportunity to sit down and talk about all things automotive, and that sector is going through huge transformation, whether it's self-driving cars, hydrogen engines, or Chinese electric vehicle manufacturing. We also spoke about espionage through LiDAR and radar and all of the technology that sits in a modern day car, right the way through to the impact of Chinese vehicles on the manufacturing sector in Europe and the US. Are we going to see the Detroitification of the automotive industry across the Western countries? Matt, nice to meet you.
Ezra, lovely to be here.
A week or 10 days ago, you didn't expect to be sat here, did you?
Not at all, no. No, but we like surprises and we like saying yes to things. So.
I know. And we've also managed to drag you off the streets in this beautiful weather. You could be home barbecuing.
I could be topping up my tan. I could be barbecuing, but no. For our one day of summer, I'm here.
Well, look,
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming along. And we were just drifting immediately into kind of a whole load of different topics, but it just helped me understand a little bit to kick off with, a bit about your background. So you work in the car sector.
I do indeed. I work for Toyota, which is, as many people I think will already know, in fact, it is the biggest global automaker based out in Japan. I work within the UK. As a senior manager within the value chain team, and I'll bore you with what that's about very shortly. But actually, my career started in quite a different industry. So I moved into accountancy. So I started working for EY and worked there for about 4 or 5 years, got trained up, and then realised, quite frankly, I did not want to be doing that. And actually, that you spend all your time at work. I'd rather be doing something that I have some interest in. Yeah. And I would say, I wasn't a car nerd. I'm not one of these people that wears, we were talking about Lycra earlier, but, I'm not one of those people that sort of turns up and wears head to toe, Jensen Button outfit and gets, really quite aroused by exhaust pipes and things like that.
Right.
But I really have always been really fascinated in the industry of cars. It's one of the traditional industries, if you like, that always felt to me to be about 10 years out of date from everything else. It's never quite, it's not within the tech sector at all. Things don't move at that kind of pace.
Yeah.
And I just saw huge opportunity in it as a result of that. The fact that you can see, travel industry, for example, is always, I would say, about 10 years ahead of automotive. You can book a holiday online. It's really straightforward.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I was looking at, we worked in the automotive space. We had a big automotive recruiter that has a different story and actually failed spectacularly. And I can elaborate on that maybe another time. Yeah. But I always saw that the same way. You always saw that it just always seemed so far behind, so prehistoric. And although now it's actually transitioned from way behind to kind of right at the forefront of tech and technology, not even technology, manufacturing, almost leading many, many markets.
Well, I think what you're witnessing today is a genuine disruption in the market in what is a huge industry, globally. In the UK alone, there are something like 800,000 people employed within automotive today. And one of the things we were talking about earlier is around the subject of AI and how many of those jobs and roles, etc., that are sort of sales focused are going to actually be fundamentally replaced. Still, 99% of vehicles that are sold in the UK, and probably most likely across the world also, are through a face-to-face sales transaction with a car dealer.
Is it still 99%? I didn't know that.
It's huge. So there's a few reasons behind that. Industry structure. So predominantly the OEMs, or the manufacturers, the likes of Toyota, Volkswagen, Ford, some of the traditional names that people know and love, they effectively retail through a franchise arrangement. So all of their retailers, primarily across the world, that's how the business expanded. Yeah. So they're independent businesses. They're not operating as agents of that business. And guess what? They don't really like online sales, because I can, as an OEM, sell you a car online at the list price or however, and I can completely cut out my middleman, or at least that's the risk that some of those retailers would see. So why you're seeing so much disruption in that kind of chain is because you've got quite a few disruptors coming in. And, this is old news to some extent. People like Tesla, who've been around now and really being successful within our market for years, they're selling direct to consumer. So, effectively when they retail a vehicle, it's through one of their owned branches or shops. So it's a very different business model, fundamentally.
Yeah, very different approach. They've taken a different approach to so many aspects of things. And coming back to that original point of yours, this whole transition from kind of laboured industry, really outdated, and now rapid change. I think you mentioned Tesla there, and innovation normally comes from competition, doesn't it? And I think, do you think they're significantly responsible for Tesla themselves kind of raising the bar?
I absolutely subscribe to that view. Yeah. When I studied economics at university, industrial economics, so really focusing on how businesses grow, how how industries develop, and etc. And one of the case studies that was always used, betraying my age a little bit here, but was that the automotive industry is almost impossible to enter. So the reason that it was effectively operating like an oligopoly, so lots of big companies, or rather few big companies, but selling at very high kind of margins, capturing that market, was because the barriers to entry were so high. Yeah, so no way in a million years could anyone say, I'm going to do a startup now and I'm going to make cars, because the cost of investment, capital, getting funding is just such a vast challenge when you're against players like Toyota or Ford, who've got huge factories all over the world. You just don't have that level of investment. Well, Tesla kind of said, well, fuck that. Let's completely flip that around. And let's, it wasn't, I think ultimately Elon bought Tesla as a very, very small niche electric vehicle startup, and absolutely turned that into, by market capitalization, at one point the biggest automotive manufacturer in the world.
Incredible, yeah.
Absolutely phenomenal, and really kind of showed the industry in the world that actually you need to be ready to be disrupted.
And you're working for Toyota, and I suppose you've been there for some time.
12 years. 12 years, I'd say.
So have you seen the impact from the inside of Toyota of what Tesla has had on Toyota? Because obviously Toyota's like you say, by sales, I think it's the largest automotive player in the world still. Yeah. So when you say that Tesla has had that impact, you felt that internally, have you, in terms of?
Yeah, I think slowly at first, but as with all things, but actually what's really scary is not necessarily the fact that Tesla have entered the market, but the fact that they have disrupted in an area that for Toyota would have been seen as a kind of area of real core competence and strength. So the other thing that happened just prior to me joining Toyota about 15, 16 years ago was the introduction of hybrid technology. And so a lot, which at the time was seen to be technically, from a technical perspective, was one of the most innovative ways to propel a vehicle along, which is kind of a halfway house between pure EV, pure electric vehicle, and the internal combustion engine. It's allowing a certain amount of both to go on in the vehicle powertrain, and of course, the Toyota Prius is a very ubiquitous vehicle. But let's contrast that Prius to the Model S, which was Tesla's first kind of mainstream vehicle launch. The Model S is still, even though it's showing its age a little bit these days, despite a couple of model refreshes, it still looks fresh. It's still a cool car. The Prius was never a cool car, which was part of the challenge. And people like South Park absolutely tore it apart fairly early on, which set the tone. But as a technology, transitioning from hybrid to pure electric, et cetera, is really quite straightforward for Toyota to do. So I think the interesting question, and one we'll maybe explore, is, well, why haven't Toyota really gone all in?
Well, that's it, because they're betting big, aren't they? I mean, they're betting big on this hybrid space. Where this leads to me, and probably a great question for you is, what the fuck is going on in China? Because I saw a graph the other day which kind of saw all the different kind of countries and continents and their manufacturing output of EVs, electric vehicles, all slowly declining. And then there was this just incredible inclining line on this graph.
Chinese exports. And I was mind blown by it. And then you see, the European sponsors, European Championship football sponsors, BYD. And they're slapping the taxes on. I mean, it is a fast moving space. So I suppose they are betting mainly on full electric. I think they have launched something around hybrid as well. You'll see a mixture. Yes, but so where does Toyota sit if they're really backing that hybrid space? Yet we're seeing this incline of exports in Chinese electrics. What's going on? It's a very interesting question. In fact, there's two questions in there, I think. So what the hell's going on in China is a multifaceted answer. It's not just the Chinese manufacturers that are attacking, effectively, or bringing this export pace out to the world, because it's the world. It's not just the UK. This is happening everywhere, and you'll see, headlines across certainly the English-speaking West around, talking about protectionism and we need to put trade barriers up to stop these imports coming in. So where's it all coming from? Well, largely, a combination of genuine enterprise. And forethought by the Chinese companies like BYD. BYD is a huge battery company, actually. That's how they started. And they are, I think, trying to rival Tesla for one of the biggest automotive companies in the world also. Right. But it's also one of government intervention. So there is a huge level of subsidization that goes on in the provision of battery technology to these Chinese manufacturers. They want to have global dominance in the export of these vehicles. And to be completely fair to them, they've seen that. They have seen that strategy as optimal for some time. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened overnight. The exports have happened overnight, sure, but they've been working, hotbedding, creating, refining really quite high quality vehicles on electric powertrains for some time. And where the Chinese government is able to act fairly rapidly, and this isn't a discussion about whether democracy is better than any other forms of government, but they're able to perhaps not consult as widely as some of the Western governments that these vehicles are going into. They're kind of been able to exploit a loophole where those governments haven't been quick enough putting up any trade barriers, etc., in order to kind of protect their industries against it. And the automotive companies themselves, Toyota included, haven't been fast enough really to see it coming. There's a real additional interesting layer that goes on top of this, which is what what is Europe and what is the UK trying to do, and the States, in terms of net zero? And are EVs, electric vehicles, alone the right choice? And going back to your question around Toyota, why hasn't Toyota gone all in on EVs? I think they would answer that question as, well, actually, our focus is on the consumer. And there are many, many ways to achieve net zero that brings the consumers along with them. So an electric vehicle today, what would you say is the average price of an electric vehicle to buy in the UK, list price as a new car?
It's not cheap, 30, 40 grand.
It's not cheap at all. I would say it's probably somewhere around 60 grand if you're going to pay cash. Now, of course, for reasons we'll get into, customers don't really pay cash for cars, and certainly electric cars. The ones that you see on the road today mostly are company cars, but we'll come on to that. Whereas, of course, a cheapest internal combustion engine car, little sort of Nissan Micra, little, those kind of vehicles, could be as low as sort of 10, 15 grand. And certainly used vehicles are all.
That's not fair, because that's not. We're not comparing apples with apples there, are we? Because the cheapest cars in combustion is 10 to 15 grand, but the cheapest cars in electric, I think. Are we talking 25, 30 there?
You could buy a little quadricycle, but really the EVs. I'm being a bit unfair. You're right in terms of pointing out the expense of those vehicles, but
there is a significant differential.
There is, and it is largely because there are economies of scale in the size of vehicle that you produce with an electric powertrain. It's got to be big enough to make it kind of worth it and be able to carry a battery. Yes. Otherwise, it's going to look really weird. A small car with a huge battery poking out the back of it.
There's so many things that you've covered, which I find fascinating. And actually, the idea was to, one of our first guests on here, just get some, and we've ended up kicking off with a probably one of, if not my most fascinating and most curious topics, and there's so many things that are layered into it. You've got the technology, you've got the autonomous elements, but even batteries themselves. I'm fascinated by the whole battery space, because the way I think about that, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, because I'm not doing a huge amount of research on it, but there must be significant tipping points in the use of battery technology where it's a power to weight ratio. That's the thing I think about when I think about batteries. Fundamentally, the amount of power out of it, the lighter they get, the more power you can get, the more useful it becomes. Is that a simple hypothesis?
Well, I should say I'm not a scientist.
No.
And the world is a better place because of it. But battery technology is going to be one of the key battlegrounds going forward into the future. So you probably heard about things like solid state batteries and the next phase on from lithium ion. And again, being a DIY dad, I think about it from just drill technology. You used to be able to get cordless drills with a nickel cadmium battery that was bigger than the drill itself.
Big old chunky thing.
You'd get huge guns just from being able to lift it, to these absolutely tiny sort of lithium ion batteries. And then who knows what's next? Solid state could be absolutely tiny, much more longer lasting. Yeah. And crucially is longevity for the batteries.
Right.
So certainly one of consumers' big concerns around batteries, they don't last forever. So unlike a fuel tank that you can fill up, empty, and unless it rusts away into nothing, you've still got a fuel tank that works at full capacity. A lithium battery doesn't do that. It wears down. It becomes less useful over time. And there's a huge, and generally over about 10 years, which kind of limits, the age of a vehicle before a battery can be replaced. But knowing also that the battery technology is advancing so quickly, and Toyota have invested heavily in solid state technology, that is the key to massive range and longevity of battery. Well, what does that mean for me in my Tesla today in 5 years' time, that my battery is degrading? Does it mean, for example, the residual value of my vehicle is going to just fall through the floor? And that is where the market is at the moment.
It's likely, isn't it?
Uncertain.
And do you think is that what plays a significant part of the Toyota strategy as well? Because actually, you're right. When these battery technologies evolve at that rate of knots, actually it becomes an incredibly devalued market for the older batteries, isn't it?
Well, it does, and knowing that technology is constantly declining, because it's a. So, in answer to your question, is that part of Toyota, the rationale behind Toyota's strategy?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Toyota's strategy is what they call a multi-path strategy. So, within the path to net zero, there are hybrid vehicles, which, by the way, reduce emissions if that's our goal. If decarbonisation is our goal, that reduces emissions by about 50% versus an internal combustion engine straight off the bat. And you can produce 10 hybrid vehicles for one electric vehicle. So that's one, sense of that argument. The other is battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, which are those that can do a certain level of distance without needing to use the engine at all. And again, they're a part of the mix. You can make something like 4 or 5 plug-in hybrid vehicles for every one battery electric vehicle for these scarce resources and for lithium, etc. And then you've got hydrogen. So hydrogen was all the rage 10 years ago. Hydrogen was the next big thing. Where's that gone? Well, it hasn't gone anywhere, in truth. It's still a very viable fuel source and technology. To fuel a hydrogen vehicle takes the same amount of time as filling up a petrol vehicle. It's not it's a volatile chemical, but no more so than something like petrol. And you can do proper ranges in it. So whereas, the average electric vehicle range today is somewhere around sort of 200 miles, something like that in real world conditions, you can have a 600-700 mile range as you would with a big fuel tank today.
And I've seen recently that there have been some real breakthroughs in terms of the innovation around this as a kind of hydrogen. At what point do you think that becomes a real player? I mean,
well, I think it could be relatively soon. I think the trick with hydrogen has been finding the right use case. I think when people say automotive or cars, we automatically think passenger cars because that's what we as consumers know and experience mostly. Right. But of course, within that, you've got heavy trucks, you've got commercial machinery, you've even got power stations on site at big, organizational fleets. Those are, well, interestingly enough, what is a question back for you, Ezra. What proportion of UK vehicle sales, all the vehicles that are sold new in the UK, do you think go to businesses rather than individuals?
No, absolutely no idea.
It's about 60%, and it's growing.
Wow.
So a lot of the volume of vehicles that we see on the road today, so pretty much 1 in every 2, if you could only see new vehicles on the road, is going to a business customer. And of course, on top of that, you've got things like lorries and trucks and buses, and those are really ripe areas for hydrogen, where you can have a fuel cell, which can be quite a large thing, but also cover vast distances. But for me, what's quite interesting is the mobile power station element, which is kind of taking it outside of automotive, really, but saying, well, these fuel cells we could have powering electric vehicles as a zero carbon solution from well to wheel. In various locations. So it goes into all sorts of areas.
But it's a real thing. So the hydrogen thing, do you predict that that's going to pick up in terms of how common an occurrence we'll see a hydrogen car floating about? Or
well, as it stands today, I would say no.
Right.
Why would I say that? Most Western governments have effectively gone all in on battery electric.
Yes.
Something called the Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate is something that you may have come across. A very long, lengthy and boring document, but fundamentally means that by 2030, now 35, as it's been extended, every single new vehicle in the UK that's sold must be a zero emission battery electric vehicle. So that really ties the hands of all manufacturers, certainly that are exporting into the UK. You could argue plays into the hands of China, who've kind of anticipated this happening.
Yep.
But it's also a great example of where government intervention potentially limits consumer choice. Because if you ask the vast majority of people on the street today, if you had to buy a new car, what would you buy? And you had them, they're not choosing battery electric vehicles because of the cost because of some things around range anxiety.
Yeah, charging range and
exactly. And you'll know this, as someone who has launched and spearheaded products into new markets. You've got to have the consensus that someone's going to want this, and people don't like things being forced upon them. And so I think there's a real challenge at the moment that it's a supply-led market as opposed to a demand-led market, and that for me is always a little bit unhealthy. It's not a great history of things working out in those scenarios. Very, very easy to kind of manipulate what the consumer benefit is.
And so if we come back to this question around China, I mean, it's phenomenal what they're doing, and it's interesting what you said about the kind of the key pillars or key drivers of what are making that happen. From what I can see, that it's just such a huge investment in terms of the production process. That and the scale at which they're sort of investing into that, and that's where I think for me, when I look at that sector, I kind of see the most significant gains. I think is in the production process, which is driving the output for into the car sector, and I just struggle to see the speed at which other European manufacturers and European businesses, even the US, can adopt that kind of approach without getting way left behind. And there's a big part of me which kind of I'm incredibly concerned. So even outside of automotive, I'm incredibly concerned about the impact that AI is going to have globally. And in the automotive sector, we've seen in the 70s the impact that Toyota had in Detroit in the US. I think there's some famous videos of people smashing up. In the US smashing up. Was it Toyota's that were smashing up?
Yeah, it was Toyota's. Yes. They made friends in the end. So.
Absolutely, they did. Yeah. I think it was by the late 70s they had actually dropped any form of like tariffs and embargoes and stuff on the Japanese. Mind you, but the Japanese are then great allies with the US, right?
They are indeed. Well, certainly post-war, but from a manufacturing point of view and the production side of things, it's a really interesting point you raise, because when Toyota came across effectively to the States, that was really where they started to invade, if you like, in the 1970s. The US wasn't ready for it. It's a very, very similar parallel scenario to what we have today. The US was a very heavily unionized domestic market, a little bit slow to produce. Quality wasn't necessarily there. And, people have historically blamed the unionized workforce for that. It's very chilled out in Detroit. But it's much, much more than that. Structurally, they had a captive market, and they therefore didn't have that pressure to innovate. Now, when Japan comes in, and Toyota in particular, they introduced the Toyota production system, which is a completely new way to build cars and build products in general. So rather than mass production, which is what effectively Henry Ford started and Ford were continuing to do up until that point, and General Motors, it sort of pioneered mass customization. And a lot of the sort of terms that you'll hear in the business, just in the business zeitgeist, even now, things like just-in-time manufacturing, things like lean production, and they make these are all came from that period. So this is what Toyota effectively introduced into the States. Yes. So they had better quality vehicles for less money, and that was a bit of a killer blow to the US.
Absolutely. I mean, well, look, it left Detroit on its knees, and I think it's only just recently, maybe what we're talking 30 years later, it's actually longer, 40 years later, it started to recover. Detroit and Chicago, those areas are actually just over the last maybe 5 or 10 years started to really pick up. But it had colossal effect. And actually, my biggest concern is that, from an AI perspective, I think that there's global effect on global industries, actually. And I think we could see the same, that Detroit situation scenario across many places. But in the automotive space, I just can't see the rate of which they're exporting vehicles is phenomenal. Like Absolutely. It's frightening. And like you said, 800,000 people in the UK are dependent on the automotive sector. Is there a possibility that we're looking at a kind of Detroit graveyard type impact across European and UK and potentially US markets? Could it get that bad, do you think?
I don't think so. And the reason for that is, I guess there's many reasons for that. But what you've got to remember is that the average lifespan of a vehicle is about 14.8 years. There you go. That's that for a bit of precision. So 14.8 years, the average life cycle of a vehicle from when it's off the factory line to when it gets torn apart in a scrapyard or cubed. That means that even if every single car tomorrow that was sold was from a Chinese manufacturer, it's going to take 14.8 years for that to wash through the entire, what we'd call vehicle park. So, and this is one of the reasons why autonomous vehicles, by the way, is a real, philosophical conundrum that doesn't need to be one necessarily, because even if every single vehicle that was sold tomorrow was autonomous, you're still looking at 15 years for that to roll through. That's very different.
Why is it going to take 15 years for that to roll through? Because as technology evolves, people will consume, people back in 1970s and 1980s, right? You bought one telephone for your life, right? Now you buy a mobile phone that had a product life cycle of 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. Now a phone has a product life cycle of 12 or 18 months, 24 months. So isn't that in itself just going to decrease? But as technology, for sure,
could do.
Autonomous vehicles, I mean, that'll probably be one of the metrics that will most likely change most significantly, because particularly, I mean, autonomous driving, we can get onto in a minute. I mean, it's just, for me, I see that actually as possibly one of the most significant milestones to a world of abundance that I hope that we're leading to. But we can get into that in a bit. But that kind of product life cycle bit, I think that as the technology evolves and the price points come down, becomes more accessible, doesn't that then just entice more people to change faster? Also, the cost of finance coming down as well.
Well, this is it. So you touched on a few things there. So I think there's an argument that you could make to say the life cycle will increase, and and you touched on the reason there actually, interestingly, which is this concept of what's the financing on it, what's the cost of it, and that implies ownership, doesn't it? Whereas I think for autonomous vehicles to work, and to a large extent for the automotive industry of the future to work, ownership needs to transform into usership. So in essence, rather than me as Toyota selling you a car, I need to keep hold of that car. That car is also loads of valuable metals that I want to get back in 14.8 years' time. And I want to retain that asset and look after it over its entire value chain. Now, with an autonomous vehicle, there's who's maintaining that vehicle? Who's because it's effectively a service you're buying. Then you're not owning a car, and also 90% of the time, if you did own it, it's sat in your driveway doing nothing, isn't it?
Well, I had this debate this week with Ed actually, and I was going through the fact that if you look at an Uber journey, it costs you 20 quid. What's the majority of that cost?
Oh, it's a great question.
Yeah, it's the driver.
Yeah, labour.
I would suggest it's probably 75-80% of it. I worked out the financing costs of a Prius on an 8-hour shift over a month is only 50 pence a journey, roughly. So it's a tiny fraction. That's just the leasing cost, right? So you're talking then about some electric and some bits and pieces, which we know is very, it's actually become much more expensive, but it's still, in terms of a journey, it's such a significantly small proportion. So you're right. The moment that you remove the driver, the cost, and that's why I say I think it's such a significant milestone to this kind of life of abundance, really, because the cost of that, and then that makes then leasing, maintaining it, this lease usership, you call it.
Usership is the concept of effectively, I don't buy it. Uber's a great example. I'm using a car. I'm using a transport facility. I don't own it. I'm renting it for that period of time. It's such a fascinating area though, because again, let's take a kind of utopian perspective on this life of abundance, where we've got autonomous cars all over the place. Why? Surely at that point it becomes like the railways. So you've basically got a national monopoly, a national, what's it called, natural monopoly on effectively the roads, because there is no autonomy effectively within that space. Human autonomy, there's vehicle autonomy, but actually we've just got an abundance of transport is what we have, and mobility. So it actually doesn't matter whether that's in cars that are AI driven, or whether it's maybe people with bikes that are AI driven. It's it then becomes effectively just a part of our overall natural monopoly infrastructure. And I think the argument would be that, do we nationalise that kind of facility, that right? Does transport become almost like a human right in that respect? But again, I would temper that view with the fact that it takes a long time for that to wash through. The first autonomous vehicle off the factory line that's driving around in the UK with no driver in it still has several million, 70 million other cars that are driving around on the road that have a human being driving that, and that will be the case in decreasing proportions for at least 14 years, or however long that life cycle lasts out. So I don't know. I think it'll be quite a bumpy path to that kind of life of abundance and utopia. And in the meantime, you've got all of those drivers that are out of work, and that labour, as you say, being removed as an equation. So, and with everything, there'll be winners and losers. And it won't be it probably won't be those that are making the money off the metal that are going to be losing.
But the reason the automotive space is fascinating is because it's kind of, there are so many. We've got a number of these Scurve technologies which are just appearing, whether it's automation, robotics, or energy, or AI. And all these things. And actually, if you look at it, the nirvana state of automotive is the combination and the compounded impact of all of those Scurve technologies. It's kind of not one or the other. It's the compounded effect of them, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all technology today is complementary, isn't it? You mentioned mobile phone. What's the mobile phone without, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and AI fundamentally soon.
But it makes it really, really fascinating to consider like you say, it's not 100% not going to be a straightforward path, but the actual implication on the cost of those services, it's transformed with the technologies that we're talking about, and also the impact on it. If they can get the performance of the batteries right, in real simple terms.
Oh yeah,
range, clean energy, and then lifetime.
Yeah,
how big an impact does that have when they have significant gains in those areas, do you think?
Well, potentially huge. It's not a zero-sum game, so it's not a winner takes all scenario. Who's got the best technology? Primarily because you're always going to have that product maturity life cycle that we're seeing today. Now, I think we're probably a little bit beyond early adopters now for electric vehicles. We're into kind of much more into the mainstream. Yes. But, if those early adopters are prepared to pay a decent premium for the new thing, when it starts to get into that mainstream area, then you start to get more cost competition. You start to see, reduction in quality, normalizing effectively of a technology. So the vehicles that you see on the road, you wouldn't necessarily know they're an electric car, but at the moment you still see these sort of futuristic sort of Blade Runner things flying around that look like someone else's vision from the future from 10 years ago. Well, that'll start to go away, and there will be a level of normalization. Right. You have to remind me of the question. I'm sorry.
No, I was talking about the actual impact of, when you actually get these batteries, when the batteries themselves, the range and their lifetime length increases. How big an impact does that really have? Because it unlocks I think you started off by saying it has a big impact. It unlocks a tremendous amount of value. Really, it answers, because they're the big questions, effectively, aren't they? They're the big constraints for its growth.
Definitely. Let's say if I sold you a house today for 10 million,
Yep.
And I told you in 10 years' time, it might be completely worthless.
Yes.
Again, it's kind of upending versus actually there's a new house technology that we're working on that will extend the life of your house to 20, 30 years. It changes the amount of value you would put on it today. So at the moment, as a consumer, where battery life and longevity is relatively uncertain, it limits the amount you're prepared to invest up front on something that may not last forever, even if you don't plan on owning it.
How big is the knowledge of the mainstream consumer over that? Do you think those are concerns which are having a big impact on consumers?
We know they are from research. It's
Right.
one of the things. So uncertainty about the technology, which really means uncertainty about how much residual value that there will be in my asset as a result of this technology, is one of the big barriers, as is things like range anxiety and so on. And some people just don't like the designs of those vehicles. But it plays a huge part in it, which is a little bit counterintuitive, because I mentioned the average age and lifetime of a vehicle. What do you think the average ownership length of a vehicle, so for an individual?
I would have said 3 years.
Very close, about 2.4 years.
Right.
So the people who are having those concerns about the long-term value of that asset actually aren't even planning on holding on to it for anywhere near that long.
I get the range thing, so I definitely see people going, and the time to charge and the availability to charge. I definitely see those. I just don't know whether the average consumer is kind of sitting there thinking, do you know what, this battery is going to be out of date in a few years and my value is going to be low. I thought, what is that? That feels like, for the reasons you said, it's kind of a more longer term.
It is. If we're taking the assumption here that the consumer's buying this car for cash, which they're probably not. They're probably buying it through a finance arrangement today. And this is where the market tells you that there's uncertainty.
Right.
So if it's all about residual values. So if effectively when you finance a vehicle, you're paying for the loss in residual value of that vehicle between now and in 3 years' time, normally 3 years, plus a bit of margin on the interest. Now, if an electric car, there's a certain amount of uncertainty that residual value, we don't think it's going to be worth very much at all after 3 years. It's going to lose more than 50% of its value. Then that will translate very immediately into the monthly payment and the amount to be financed on that vehicle.
Yeah.
This is why, with a much more certain technology, internal combustion engine, we've been selling those for years. We know how much that's going to be worth in 3 years' time. Very, very different. So at the upfront point of pricing, EVs, electric vehicles, can look too expensive because of the amount of, you're not financing what the car list price is.
Yes. You're
financing the residual value over that period. So that's how it kind of forces consumers to have those concerns. And then of course they look into, well, why is it that this car costs the same? It's $30,000 car. I can have it in electric or petrol, and the electric one's twice as expensive every month. Yeah. Why is that? Those are the kind of real world scenarios where consumers are kind of seeing that.
That would, absolutely, and that's going to slow down the acquisition of those. But with these BYD and these other businesses bringing the cost of these vehicles down is significantly.
That's going to make a huge difference. Yeah. It's the way to play. Effectively, going all the way back to the 1980s now, but a guy called Michael Porter said there's 3 generic business strategies that you can employ.
Yep.
You can be a cost differentiator, you can be a quality differentiator, or you can effectively try and blend the two, diversify effectively.
Yep.
China's strategy is very much cost. They not necessarily, they can produce these vehicles at a much lower cost, and they're using that advantage to leverage price, which kind of allows them to overcome that uncertainty, that residual value loss. People like Tesla, interestingly, again, there was a huge shake-up not shake-up, it was a big news story in the industry. It probably didn't break through to page 20 in most newspapers, but Tesla cut the cost of its vehicles very dramatically. Back it was about a year ago now. It took $5,000 off the cost of a Model 3 straight away, and the market went absolutely mental. Why? Not because it was just so great for consumers, but because taking that $5,000 off massively impacted the residual value of those vehicles that are coming back.
Yes.
So there were cars that are, had been owned for, a year, 2 years on finance deals, that then suddenly
Immediately
a new one's worth
underwater.
less. So completely underwater. So it's kind of like a negative equity scandal.
Yes.
But really, really fascinating. And that kind of was written up as kind of the naivety of Tesla, actually, because they thought, as you would, I want to sell more cars. I can I've started getting some cost efficiencies because of my scale. Let's just cut costs. And actually, the law of unintended consequences is, well, it completely fucked up the other end of their business.
Yeah.
So it's kind of sort of balanced itself out now. But I think the key takeaway to this area is we just don't know really what's going to happen. We can all have some intelligent guesses about how it's going to play out, but the market doesn't. The market will tell us itself effectively.
And governments are also intervening, aren't they? There's no doubt governments are already slapping huge tariffs. I think the US is at 100%, isn't it? Is it 100% tariff on Chinese cars? I mean, this is just incredible.
And the EU won't be far behind, I suspect.
Yeah. So there will be measures and limits on those, which will slow up the impact.
Yeah, there will. But I think there's a moral question around that. What is the objective effectively of this huge powertrain shift in vehicles? If it is to achieve net zero, then why are we protecting so much our own competitors, our own manufacturers from that level of competition?
Yeah.
If the goal is effectively, to maximise profit, or maximise gross national product, or whatever it is, still, we know that free trade is better than this vast protectionism.
Yeah.
So the only argument that we can kind of, but at the same time, we know that China is massively subsidising through government control there. The only argument, generally speaking, an economist would put forward to say, well, this is why, having protectionism, big tariffs and stuff like that is important, is to protect kind of an infant industry. So if we were, let's say, and we may be doing this in things like AI, if we want Britain, for example, to be one of the leaders in AI technology, well, let's protect that industry within the UK so that it's more expensive to take in, to use OpenAI or whatever it is, or international competitors, so that they can build up the strength and scale, so that, and then we take those protection barriers away and we compete in a free market on a fair level playing field.
On a more mature sector.
In a more mature sector, that's weird, isn't it?
Yes.
That is literally just saying no, thank you.
Because the people that are being impacted most are consumer, right? And second of all, I mean, but there's a fine balance at the speed of which they're going to have that impact. But do you know where I see governments having the biggest impact? Here's my sort of theory or hypothesis on. I think they're going to play the TikTok card.
Okay.
Right. So I just don't see, right, if they think having TikTok is a clear route to espionage, then surely having hundreds of thousands, millions of mobile cameras, microphones, and capturing data, roaming around our countries. And surely they've thought about that. I mean, they must have done. So I just don't see it at some point that card's not played. Because, literally, it's just, you'd be like, all right, guys, all the Chinese spies, you can pop home now. Why is that? Because we've got 3 million vehicles which are going around for recording and videoing and recording and every move. I mean, they can have all of the people inside them. I mean, internal. It's just so where is that just is that not just a real threat?
I don't know. I mean, I would say TikTok's probably a more efficient vehicle for espionage.
Yeah, it is.
Assuming you can get people on it than a whole car. But it is, there is some spooky technology in new cars, and even I get driver inattention warnings because it's tracking my eye movements, and it's pretty full on technology, without a huge amount of data protection and security around it. In reality, we've been through this a little bit with 5G implementation and rollout in Huawei in the UK. I think the bigger argument on Chinese imported vehicles, because effectively, as long as you control the information architecture that information is flying around in your country and make sure it doesn't get out, then I don't think the car's going to be the biggest challenge. For sure, it's a card that we could have pulled, or you'd certainly have expected the states to pull if they were going to. It's part of the rationale for putting 100% tariffs on.
Yes.
But yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting and notable that they haven't. But I suspect they probably think that people would see through that. And also, you've got to remember that there are big moves in the AI space, which is causing people more concern and fear at the moment when it comes to that kind of technology.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I saw something this morning, which is just a business I stumbled across, which basically removes all the apps from your phone. So you you can then just ask. You just ask your phone what you need, and it just provides you instantly with the app you need. So you don't have any app that's kind of visible, and you kind of think, actually, that just makes total sense. So just user experience. Everything that we're doing is just going to change so significantly.
Well, anything that requires, I guess, self-thought and self-selection is what we'll start to see eroding. Next best action is one of the things that people like to say when they talk around algorithms and what they do for you.
Yes.
And that does make me worry, honestly, in terms of, where's the humanity in something that you're not almost in control of your destiny. Your next best action is being determined for you.
I think the breadth of it, the breadth of the impact is the most, and the speed of it, the barriers to entry, the speed to growth is just, speed of growth is just, I just don't think that the world can prepare quickly enough for it. And I think actually the biggest thing that everyone kind of offsets it, they go, well, what will happen is there'll be these new jobs appearing. I just don't see how the speed of new industries will evolve at a rate at which the change is employed. But but hopefully, the way I view it is that we're all journeymen helping to create this life of abundance for our successors, sadly. So that the future, you and I will be sitting here in this world of abundance that you and I have just gone through phases and phases of generation and change and hard work to help create for them.
Well, but they're fate. I mean, to be honest, I think that's what we all do to the younger generations to us, don't we? It was harder in my day.
Well, luckily, for sure. Luckily, you got to enjoy the journey. On that note, and actually probably a good place to think about it, in that car sector, how far are we away from that kind of utopia, do you think, when you look at what we're doing, where we are autonomous, we have much more efficient and kind of scalable technology where it becomes just an abundantly available resource? How far are we?
I think we're quite a long way off, if I'm honest. And that's not to say us as a global population, because I think you will see countries making big investments in this space. Fundamentally, it's one of infrastructure. So interesting enough, one of the things that Toyota are doing in Japan, they've effectively created a new city from scratch in the foothills of Mount Fuji, called Woven City, which is their hybrid vision. Their hydrogen vision of what future society could look like, and what mobility and transport could look like in its entirety. It's definitely well worth a look, because it is trying to it's trying to say, well, look, we don't really know where the future's going or what it looks like. Let's build what we think it could look like.
Awesome project.
Yeah, absolutely massive. I'd love to go. I need to. I don't know whose leg I need to pull to pretend that I need. I've got a business reason to go out there. But it's absolutely fascinating experimental city effectively. And there will be people living in there.
How big is this?
It's pretty big. I think it's. I've only seen pictures of it, but I think it's got enough to have a population of sort of 5,000-6,000. I think so. You're talking sort of a segment of a city effectively, carved out.
Great.
But exactly for that, how does how is autonomy going to work? How are mobile shops going to look? Because of course.
But the Chinese have got that. They've got it up and running. It is functional, isn't it? Autonomous driving in public transport is up and running over there.
I'm not too close to the Chinese rollout of autonomous vehicles, but I know certainly within the US, it's been it's been being trialled in California for a decade.
Yes.
There are limited trials in the UK also, and I think generally it's taken much longer than people thought it was going to take. Not for some of the philosophical reasons that you and I might have talked about 5-6 years ago, like, well, whose fault is it if we run someone over? Who pays the insurance? Those kind of questions. Yeah. But much more around actually the tech, and the tech just isn't there. So I'd be surprised if the Chinese have got fully operational autonomous vehicles out there. Yeah. The reality is the weakest link is the other vehicles that are not autonomous. So they are driven by an unpredictable actor, which is the human. And as I said earlier, it's going to take, even if every single autonomous new vehicle sold from today was autonomous, it's going to take a while before that washes through. Yes. And all vehicles are autonomous, and it works like a system. Mm. And then when it works like a system, that's when it's effectively infrastructure. It's not transport. It's not individual vehicles. It's a system. It's like a train line.
It feels like it's going to be a kind of death by a thousand cuts type approach, really, because we've kind of seen the things that they've done with the diesel, with diesel motors, haven't they? And actually completely devalued the diesel market.
Yes.
And so it kind of feels like it's just one thread at a time. I wonder whether that's going to pick up, though, because you just think about if technology is the biggest barrier, then the development, technology's development is expedited right now at an unparalleled rate, isn't it? And the things that you weren't capable of doing even 2 or 3 years ago are now just becoming.
It's an interesting story about government intervention, isn't it? Because you're right. The evolution or revolution in electric vehicles that's happening now is happening at real pace.
Yeah,
but it's likely happening at a real pace, not because that's what people said they wanted, but because governments have intervened very heavily and said, actually, no, in 5 years' time, that's all you can sell, guys. And so it's kind of forced that. The interesting question for me is, well, what, and it could be the same with autonomous vehicles too, once that is ready. But the interesting question for me is, what are we missing out on by not allowing free market economics to take its course?
Right.
Diesel, you mentioned diesel. Diesel's a great example. Diesel was the most popular powertrain of all vehicles in the UK, at least, and most of Europe, for about a decade, up until probably about just pre-lockdown, probably. It's now the smallest proportion of new vehicles are sold with diesel powertrain. Why is that? Did people really love diesel? They love the smell of it. That wonderful sort of slightly agricultural noise you get, when you turn on. Or was it the fact that they were just maximising tax incentives for company cars? Because diesel produces lower CO2, it's therefore cheaper to tax, cheaper vehicle tax. Of course, it was the latter. And I think that's probably what we're seeing a little bit of in the EV space right now. In fact, I know that because, something like 90% of all the electric vehicles that are being sold are going through company car channels. So they're just cheaper for tax purposes to run as a company car. But that's not true choice. Effectively, that is a manipulated choice for consumers.
Yeah.
The question for me is what are we missing out as a result of that manipulated choice? So, for example, if we'd said, actually, let's go all in on hydrogen, we might have hydrogen refueling stations all over the place. Maybe it's a better technology. It's a bit like in the AI space saying, do you know what? And this is probably more true than it ought to be. But Google Gemini's crap. Let's just focus on OpenAI and go all in on OpenAI. Anyone who wants to use AI, call up Sam Altman. He's the guy. We're only using him. There are benefits to that because then there's standardization and it gets everyone moving in a certain direction. And you could argue maybe there's a bit more governmental one-to-one control over it. But there's massive disadvantages as well.
Yep.
Not least that...
Yeah, competition drives innovation.
Yeah, exactly. What incentive would there be for OpenAI 5 or 6 to be really great? There's... Yeah. my fear, I think, for my industry is that that's the path that we're going down. We're seeing constrained innovation and entrepreneurialism because of government intervention.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think you're right. It's really interesting you should say that, because sadly, I think that the impact on consumers today of all of these technologies is going to be so profound that they are going to have to step in and manipulate it. That's just a fact. And we all, probably more so than ever since the Twitter files, realise that we live in a more manipulated world than we could ever dream of. But the point being that it just feels like, I think the only way that it can be controlled and it is through kind of government intervention, but they have to try and do that, you're right, without constraining its evolution and progress and innovation, because it's the impact. We are on a route, and there's no doubt, in my opinion, cost of manufacturing production is coming down, and resources and services are becoming more sustainable and more available. And that leads us eventually to a life of a more abundant life of abundance is a pretty opaque world, but a more abundant life. But they've got to do it in a way. And I actually have a view, which is that if we get it right and they get that legislation right, they've got to get on the front foot. Governments, they need to get aligned on many of these issues, and they also need to get on the front foot and ahead of it, because if they do that, I think we can actually, the way I describe it is, we can get into a better, more caring, healthier kind of world. It's the issue's going to be when they're on the tail end of it, and they're just trying to catch up with it all.
I agree. I think the role of government here is to help us identify and pin down what the end goal is. So what's that vision for that life of utopia? What does it look like?
That's about getting ahead of it,
But that's an output, yeah. So again, sort of taking it into the car industry, the output that we're chasing here is zero CO2, net zero effectively. Why are we being prescriptive about the input that leads to that? That for me is where government's potentially going wrong. So I think. It's very unusual for government. If government set a goal, which was, look, by 2035, you need to be net zero CO2 in all of the vehicles that you sell. That's very different from saying you need to have only battery electric vehicles that you sell, isn't it? That's very prescriptive, and that's where I think some of that danger comes in. I think that's where it's a bit like saying, we will only accept that you are AI enabled if you use Google Gemini or whatever it is that we've favoured. That's where you restrict competition and innovation.
Yeah, you're right, and but I think that where it becomes an issue is, you're absolutely right, we need to be very clear where we're heading, but I think it's not in an isolated way. So CO2 being one key milestone, absolutely. But I think it's the impact of that. It's having this broad vision as to where are we heading, and climate is a part of that. And because you're right, probably one of the quickest ways we could get there is by just taking the tax off of these Chinese electric vehicles and flooding the market and getting there, which would drive innovation even faster. Tesla would have to butt their ideas up, and it brings costs down, innovation forward, and we get to that place even faster. The impact, though, on the 800,000 people working in the UK in this sector, or the already declining people that work in the German sector, is going to be, it will be huge. So it's kind of they've got to find a set of kind of guardrails that get us there in one piece, really.
Yeah, they do need to shepherd us along, and they've got a tough job to do. And,
I agree.
Free market, leaving the free market to itself completely would not result in a utopian society at all. We wouldn't have any lampposts, for example. I wouldn't be paying for all pavements. I wouldn't be investing in that just so Ezra can walk around to work.
So funny.
So we do need to get the balance right, but we also need to encourage entrepreneurialism as much as possible. How would an entrepreneur go about this problem? they would probably, rather than say, look, we need to go all in on EVs, one argument is that they might say, well, actually, what are we good at in the UK? Whether we need to go all in on, I don't know, whatever it is, but baked bean power cars, a differentiator and explore those.
It's a global issue which can be, and that nut can be cracked with all various different ways and solutions. And it's the combination of those solutions which you're suggesting there. It's a combination of solutions which will get us there.
I think so. And that, by and large, is kind of Toyota's approach to this current challenge is actually multi-path. In the legislation, in the world markets that will allow it, multi-path is what they see kind of driven by choice, is the future of powertrain technology.
Coming back to Toyota, are you preparing yourself for the top job?
Absolutely, yeah.
He's on his last leg.
I've got a beeline into Japan now.
He's on his last legs, is he not?
No,
he's got more interest in rally driving, and is it what is he actually doing? What motorsports is it he's doing? Is it like the GP or something?
Well, when he's not sort of diving into a bath full of gold coins, I imagine. No, he's a massive. Akio Toyoda is a huge, I think, grandson of founder. Is a huge motorsport enthusiast, and there's a whole division of Toyota called the Gazoo Racing division, which I think he likes to occupy a lot of his time on. Which is great because it brings a certain level of cachet and credibility to our vehicles in motorsport. I said it's not an area that I'm particularly interested in personally, is motorsport, but it takes all sorts, and it does lead to positive innovation in the vehicles. So we did a round in Le Mans 24-hour race, operated a full hydrogen Le Mans vehicle, for example, for the full 24 hours. So to kind of showcase, test, and learn around that technology, it's a huge engineering effort. But I guess if I am angling for the top job, I'm going to have to get into that a bit harder.
Well, thanks for coming along today. It's
Absolute
been
pleasure.
Genuinely insightful, challenging, and fun.
Yeah.
You'll have to come back in because I'd like to actually tackle the whole e-mobility bike thing with you.
Yeah, love that.
Yes, we need to do that because that is a different world, and I think that whole battery to power rate ratio is the path to hoverboards. Actually,
This is what we want. We want hoverboards. Well, do you know, interestingly, Lexus did actually make a hoverboard.
Really?
And it does actually work.
Wow.
In America about 5-6 years ago, something like that. You look it up on YouTube. I mean, when I say it works, you can probably go about 10 meters and then it'll die. But it's a genuine hoverboard,
cool.
Which is a big moment for me.
Yeah,
Back to the Future fan.
No, good. So next time, e-mobility.
E-mobility, you're on.
Yeah, let's
absolutely.
do it. Thank you for coming along. Lovely to spend some time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.